Okay, thank you for having me. My name is Jocelyn Akins. I founded and I'm the director of Cascades Carnivore Project. We're a nonprofit organization that does research throughout Washington's Cascades on the Cascade red fox, the wolverine, and the Canada lynx. Oh, next slide, please. I can't change it. Just wanted to thank our funders and collaborators. This is a really big effort, lots of partners involved. Next slide. So the Cascade red fox is a rare mountain fox subspecies that occurs only in Washington's Cascade Range, where it inhabits subalpine parklands and the upper mountain forests. Mountain red foxes have a unique evolutionary history, which is evidenced by their distinct genetic signature. The first red foxes to migrate into North America came across the Bering Land Bridge 300,000 years ago, and then they adapted to the glacial climate of the most recent ice age, which lasted 100,000 years. And when that ice age ended, they migrated upslope into the mountains of the American West as the ice sheets were receding back to the poles. And in the mountains, they became isolated and diverged from all other red foxes. Next slide, please. Today, the Cascade red fox lives around treeline on the Cascade volcanoes and other high elevation areas. And we've been working at Mount Rainier National Park since 2010. It is one of the last strongholds of this rare fox. Specific locations of occurrence and details of their habitat associations, in particular how they rely upon the upper mountain region as a whole, is largely unknown. For example, how much do they forage in the mid-elevation forests versus the subalpine or the alpine zones? Next slide. This map is from Keith Aubrey's research, it shows the red polygon centered along and just east of the Cascade crest. And this is the historical distribution of this native Cascade red fox. It comes from trapper records, from museum specimens, which were largely from trappers, and from sighting reports from the Department of Fish and Game at the time. The blue is the distribution of red foxes that are not native to Washington. So you can see this really disjunct and distinct distribution difference. Next slide. Cascade red foxes are rare. They occupy remote mountainous habitats and they're fairly elusive. So all these things make it hard to study them or just to find them. When we began our research, which this snapshot map shows in 2008, they were rarely seen in the mountains outside of a few locations, and one of them was Mount Rainier National Park. You can see that in the red box there. And to the north, so north of Snoqualmie Pass and Interstate 90, there was just 2 detections at the time that we began studying them at Mount Rainier and in the South Cascades. Next slide. I did a comprehensive genetic analysis of the Cascade red fox habitat associations, their population genetics, and their connectivity across the region. And we realized that while they were well connected across the South Cascades, their numbers were likely quite low and their genetic diversity was extremely low. And this led to their listing last year as endangered in Washington. Next slide. So our research has shifted to working with partners to understand what is driving their decline by looking at fine-scale ecological processes, and we're fitting foxes at Mount Rainier and the surrounding areas with GPS collars so we can identify which parts of their habitat are most critical to protect and also determine how coyotes are affecting their movements. Next slide. We also have a new and fairly challenging project to assess the effects of climate change on their key prey and to understand how fox relationships with other carnivores may be shifting as mountain habitats warm. We're using DNA metabarcoding to sequence each piece of DNA in the fox's scat and create these diet profiles that covers the breadth and then of their diet, their food habits, and then also keys into what are the most important prey species. And this provides a picture of how vulnerable Cascade red foxes are to changes to their habitat that are affecting their prey and seeing if there are links to climate change. Next slide. So luckily, most carnivores utilize trails. And we're doing this scat collection method in North Cascades National Park as well for Cascade red fox.
Hey, nice.
Someone might want to mute themselves. That has a pet. Cascade red. So we're doing this work in North Cascades National Park as well, and Cascade red foxes, wolverines, and Canada lynx. And the neat thing about this methodology is that you can detect many other rare species opportunistically through the DNA sequencing of the scats. Next slide. So our field crews survey thousands of miles of trails, searching intensively for scats along the trails and then also along natural wildlife corridors such as ridge lines and passes. And we're collecting scats based on a visual ID in the field. Next slide. It takes a ton of samples across a large landscape to answer the research questions. So this has been a real ongoing process we're in the middle of. And we also archive samples for future genotyping. So we preserve them for the DNA metabarcoding, which is fairly straightforward, high success, short fragments of DNA, and then to try and get information on the populations we're preserving for genotyping. Next slide. Shifting gears here. We're also monitoring the return of wolverines to the South Cascades and to Mount Rainier. Next slide. Wolverines were not known to occur in the South Cascades in the 1990s. So this map is from the verifiable database of wolverine detections for Washington. And you can see there was just a couple of reports, and these are verifiable, so they'd be associated with a photograph or a DNA sample. But there was nothing south of I-90, nothing at Mount Rainier. Next slide. So then in 2005, the Yakima Nation documented a wolverine on Mount Adams. So that's that southern red dot there. So things were kind of changing in the South Cascades. Next slide. And then this map just skips ahead a decade from the last one, and it shows that there's many more verifiable observations being recorded. We're starting to see detections at Mount Rainier, which is the central blob of red dots in near the bottom there. Next slide. So you can detect wolverines from camera stations, but it's difficult to identify individuals, and especially females and males. It's hard to know how wolverines are doing when they roam these large areas, and you can't distinguish individuals, and you're not documenting reproduction. So it's hard to get a handle of what's going on. Next slide. So these are wolverines we documented in the South Cascades, and we had no idea how many they represented, how many there were here. Next slide. So we shifted gears. In 2016, we set up a long-running array of wolverine monitoring stations, and this includes 7 at Mount Rainier National Park. Next. And this is just an illustration of the setup. These stations can do 4 things. So they can identify individual wolverines based on the unique white marks on their throat and chest. That's called a blaze. They can collect hair samples, and they can determine the wolverine's sex and also its reproductive status. Next. This is what the setup looks like. Thanks. In the field, the station is set up a tree so it stays above the maximum snow line, and it can run all winter. Next. Hair samples get collected on wire brushes and clips, and we can utilize that DNA to determine where the individuals came from, so what's their genetic origin, and then how they're related to each other. Next. Here you can see 2 different individuals based on their chest blazes, and on the right in the red box, this shows a lactating female. This meant that she had wolverine kits nearby. Next. And just one more time, and I'll show a video. Oh, maybe go back. Anyway, there's a video of adorable wolverine kits, and we were, oh, here you go. So we were able to locate her den, which was just outside of Mount Rainier, and it's only the 3rd found in Washington in modern times. Next slide shows the entrance of the den. So wolverines dig down into the snowpack in the middle of the winter. The official birthday of wolverines is actually tomorrow, Valentine's Day, as they typically give birth from January to March. Next slide. And at the very end of 2019, in Mount Rainier National Park, we documented a new wolverine to the South Cascades, and from genetic samples, we later learned it shared the same genetic lineage with wolverines from the North Cascades. So it had likely crossed the checkerboard of logged and restored landscapes at Snoqualmie Pass to make it to the protected habitat of Mount Rainier. I-90 is a significant barrier for wildlife cutting through the middle of the Cascades. So it creates a challenging link for connecting wolverine populations. And so it's with hope that wolverines are successfully crossing this major highway at times. Okay, just got 2 more slides. Next. That wolverine at Mount Rainier turned out to be a reproducing female as well. Next slide. And though we didn't find her den, and this is a video also, we knew that it was deep in Mount Rainier. And this wolverine has reproduced. Hopefully the video can start. She's reproduced every year for the past 4 years. And this is shedding light on where denning habitat occurs in the South Cascades and provides a place to start thinking about how to recover the wolverine population. And that's it. There's one more slide, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions for Dr. Akins? Akins or Atkins? Sorry.
Akins, yeah, no problem.
Clarified. Akins, okay.
I think I saw is the wolverine population growing or shrinking. So it is growing, and it's being impacted by climate change because they're so associated with snow. So it's very much a period of trying to get a handle on the status of the population, you know, in these smaller windows every 5 years or so. But they're definitely expanding. Like we are documenting a recolonization right now. It's just not very many individuals.
Another question, is there any sign of them using the highway wildlife crossings either over or under I-90?
They have never been documented on any of the cameras, even though those are really amazing cameras.
What are the next steps for your study?
Expand to get more genetic samples north of I-90 because there's a bit of a gap in sampling by other researchers. And then this fox trapping work that's getting going and being able to learn as much as we can about them. And then we are doing an abundance estimate for Mount Rainier for the Cascade red fox. So figuring out how many remain because it is really one of their last strongholds, the park.
And was the wolverine with the North Cascade genetics post wildlife bridge over I-90?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. But that one that was on Mount Adams, that was pre overpasses, and I think the one you're referring to was after one of the bridges was built.
And you got a compliment there. Missing from the slides was the impressive grit of the wolverine researchers. So,
thank you.